My name's Maya Hariri. I'm from AUB Lebanon. My question is, when it comes to young children, we educate them about media literacy and we teach them to ask questions, and a lot of questions. So when should we stop answering them? When do we put the limit to not to break the innocence of childhood?
Well, let's talk a little bit about the idea of encouraging children to ask questions. You know, children are naturally curious, and almost all the questions that they ask revolve around how and why. And how and why questions are really powerful. It turns out that when adults answer children's questions, sometimes their interpretation of the question is the problem, right? So if a child asks, how are babies born? Well, that can create all kinds of complexities for the parent. So a big part of learning how to talk with children and to answer their questions is to understand what's going on in their heads. And so I actually think that a sympathetic listener who is thinking about the child and the child's point of view will know what the right level of detail is and what the right time to stop answering questions is. But I never would want to lead children to think that all questions can be answered or that some questions shouldn't be asked. And so I think it's really important for kids to know that many of the most important questions we have, especially about media and technology, we don't have good answers, and we don't know. And I think one of the most important things we can say to children when they ask a question is, I don't know.
My name is Judy Munge from Kenya. I'm a student at the University of Nairobi pursuing a master's in communication studies. My question is, how do you promote media literacy in rural areas where they use a radio or two at most as the main source of information and hence not so vulnerable to opinion leaders?
Media literacy takes different forms in different countries and in different parts of the world, depending on the education system and depending on the media system. And so in parts of the world where people get limited choices of what kind of media they get, in rural Kenya, for example, where only the radio is the sole information and entertainment source for a community, then the idea of media literacy necessarily takes a different form. One thing that's difficult in an environment like that is to do the classic instructional technique of cross-media comparison, where you compare one source of information to another source of information in order to identify the point of view. That's very difficult to do when, for instance, in parts of China, when the Chinese graduate students say to me, how do we do media literacy in China when CCTV basically controls all of the broadcast television outlets? Even though they might be different channels, they're still controlled by the same central government agency. I think in this case, then, the form that media literacy takes is a little different, because we have to then focus on how those messages were constructed and what meaning we make from them. Because people always have their local personal knowledge base and that of their community as powerful sources of information. So people can compare the story that's told to them from the government and the story they see and observe in their own community, right? And that can be a powerful source of insight. And then I think it's also important to think about this idea about asking questions as it pertains to having only one information source. Because it turns out that we pay different kinds of attention to media messages. And depending on our life experience and our background, we may both see or read or listen to the same report, but we may make very different interpretations of it because of other information and other life experiences that we bring. So I think in a situation where people are limited to the diversity and quality of information sources, then an approach to media literacy necessarily focuses on our reflective and thoughtful interpretation of the messages we do receive. And media literacy then focuses on empowering people to create their own information sources. Because it turns out that although we may be limited in the information, the official information that we receive from information sources in rural areas, say for instance in parts of Africa, that in fact there is a wealth of information to be found, within walking distance, right? If we learn to tell the stories and appreciate the information that comes to us from our neighbors and our community leaders. I think in many cases in traditional societies, it's thought that only certain kinds of people have the authority to be the storyteller, right? Only men can tell stories, right? Only leaders can tell stories. But it turns out that children have very worthwhile stories to tell that we can all learn from, and that women and that people, that elders have stories that are very important. So I think helping people learn to tell their stories and to recognize the value of sharing stories is an important part of bringing media literacy to rural communities.
My name is Oscar Tullist. I'm from the UK and I study at Bournemouth University. My question concerns the representation of media studies. In the UK, media studies is seen as a soft subject, and it's frowned upon as something that only the lazy study. I want to know how we can remove this stigma, and I want to know what you think we can do to convince those that it's something that we need to learn about from an early age.
And for almost all of human history, going all the way back to the Greeks, really, there's always been a sense of knowledge as having a hierarchical structure. Some knowledge is considered more privileged, and other knowledge is considered more mundane and ordinary. Well, depending on what part of the world you're in, physics might be at the top, right? Maths and physics might be at the top, and then work your way down, right? And the hierarchy will shift depending on the culture, of course, but the hierarchy exists, and it's partly because people use hierarchy to establish identity, and hierarchy is a form of power, and so people use those kinds of status labels as a proxy for personal power. There's two ways to address that when it comes to studying the media, and by the way, to studying education, because both of those subjects are considered at the very, very bottom of the hierarchy. I mean, we could debate which is lower, to study education or to study media. They're both way, way down. Part of the reason for that consists of the fact that we all have such intimate personal knowledge of it. It's hard for us to imagine it as a specialist subject when we all consume media and we all have been in classrooms. And I think that it makes people feel entitled to have opinions about these topics, regardless of whether they have any knowledge or not. And on the one hand, that's partly why these subjects have such popularity and appeal. Okay, we know the number of A-level examinations in media studies is growing and growing and growing. And it's not because it's an easy class, as much as it is because it's perceived to be highly relevant and meaningful to students. It connects the classroom to their life. And I think, in a way, what's happening in the culture right now is that, and I worry about this a little bit, the idea that education is kind of a priesthood, right? That you have to kind of, a set of hoops you have to jump through in order to, get something. As opposed to subjects like media studies and education, where the idea is to prepare yourself with the skills and competencies you need to be successful in the world outside the classroom. because these subjects are so immediately relevant and useful to daily life in any field or profession. So I think I'd like to see a re-hierarchization that's based on subjects that are most relevant to address pressing needs in the society being high up in the hierarchy. That would put medicine very high up, for example, and public health very high up, but would also put education and media high in the relevance scale as well. But there's one more way of answering your question, which I think does speak to why media studies is sometimes considered soft. And I think it's something that we teachers need to, and students need to tackle directly. And that has to do with this idea of having high expectations. It sometimes turns out in arts-related fields, right? Art being the subjective and personal thing that it is, that who can judge what is good art? Who can judge what is a good critical analysis of a horror film or whatever? And so our own refusal to engage in setting high standards comes from some humility around our inability to really evaluate how does art contribute to the world, and how do we define what is quality? It's a topic where some subjects, where there's a right or wrong answer, have a much easier time of it, and in the area of the arts and humanities, we wrestle with this. Still, I think that setting high expectations and being precise about our goals and objectives could help media studies to be perceived as a more rigorous subject. I think sometimes we teachers, we don't clarify for ourselves why we are teaching what we're teaching. We don't ourselves clarify the goals and objectives of an assignment or of a course of study. And so the fuzzy, soft features of the curriculum come from our own lack of precision in thinking about our goals and objectives. And I think that's something that partly how media literacy contributes to that is by explicitly having conversations about teaching and learning of media. Then we help teachers gain more self-awareness of what their own goals and objectives are and how to design learning experiences more productively for students.